Hello, Brobs. We're back with Three Loves of Dostoevsky by, what's his name? Marc Slonim. We are on the first part, section 7, Maria, the First Love. When, in 1854, Dostoevsky found himself in Semipalatinsk, I should look that up. Hold on. It's apparently Semipalatinsk. He was a mature man of 33. During his penal servitude, he had attained mastery over his moods, or at least over their outward manifestations. His former traits of reserve and secretiveness had intensified, while what he called his absence of form or of manners had taken on the character of harshness and even eccentricity. He had also undergone an inward upheaval. He had rejected the former social theories that had brought about his arrest, had accepted his punishment, and having come in contact with actual representatives of dark Russia, had changed his opinions about the common people. He felt more strongly than ever the necessity of a faith in God, while Christ, who suffered on the cross and redeemed the sins of mankind through his death, became for him the closest and most comprehensible image of man and a symbol of the religion of all forgiveness and compassion. Believe this, that there is nothing more splendidly beautiful, more profound, more sympathetic, wiser, manlier, and of greater perfection than Christ. There is not, and there cannot be. Nor is that all. If anyone were to prove to me that Christ is outside of truth, and if it were actually to turn out that truth is outside of Christ, I would want to remain with Christ rather than with truth, he wrote Mrs. N. von Vizina upon his release from penal servitude. Yet almost at the same time, in February 1854, he wrote to Michael, I am a child of the age, a child of unbelief, and doubt to this very day. And this I know, until the coffin lid comes down on me. What fearful torments this thirst to believe has cost me, and is still costing me. His former tendency to daydream remained, yet even that had changed greatly. Now, much more than in his youth, he knew the difference between the earthly Aphrodite and the celestial. He had witnessed and lived through a great deal during the stages of his transportation and his stretch at hard labor in the prison at Omsk, where his comrades in misfortune went in either for sodomy or making love to market women, the mere sight of whom was enough to make one's blood run cold. He had grown so unused to feminine society that he dreamt of it as the highest happiness and arrived in Semipalatinsk with secret longings which he himself feared to admit. He was very much in the position of a convalescent after a mortal illness, who feels with redoubled force all the splendor and seductiveness of being. He himself wrote, I had a great deal of hope. I wanted to live. And he wanted to love as well. A few months after coming to Semipalatinsk, he met Alexander Itziev and his wife, Maria, at the home of Lieutenant Colonel Belikov. Isaev, who at one time had been an instructor at a gymnasia directed by his father-in-law, had come to Semipalatinsk as a controller of the distillation and sale of liquor. His position was a sinecure, but liquor itself held an unfailing attraction for him. He lost his post, and finding himself without a job and without means, took to drinking harder than ever. Poor in health, weak in willpower, he fell into the company of drunkards and scoundrels, of whom there were a good many in the little town, and in a short while was altogether down and out. When in his cups, he liked to orate, I assume, about the loftiness and fineness of his feelings, and assured Dostoevsky that he loved him both as man and writer. Dostoevsky had these words to say about Isiev 2 years later in a letter to Michael. He led a most irregular life and besides was quite disorderly by nature, passionate, obstinate, and grown a little coarse. He had sunk very low in the opinion of the town and had many unpleasant experiences. At the same time, he has suffered many undeserved persecutions from the society here. He was as carefree as a gypsy, full of self-esteem, proud, did not know how to control himself, and, as I've said already, was slipping horribly. Yet, with all that, his was a greatly developed nature of the utmost kindness. He was educated and understood everything one might broach to him in conversation. He was, despite all the mire, exceedingly noble. Undoubtedly, Dostoevsky, the novelist, was very much interested in the noble drunkard with ambition. Probably that image came to life again in his memory when several years later he was creating the characters of Marmeladov in Crime and Punishment and Lebedev in The Idiot. When his acquaintance with Dostoevsky began, Isiev was already ill and wretched. The Society of Semi-Palatins, made up of officials and army officers and their wives, disliked and despised him. The local authorities were indignant over his drunken speeches and impotent sorties. His sprees and shiftless life had reduced his family to poverty and debt. Dostoevsky often pled with him and lectured him, but all that did not help, and everything went on as before. Maria, Isiev's wife and the mother of his 7-year-old boy, Pasha, suffered very much from the situation her husband had brought about. Her father, Dmitri Constant, chief of quarantine of Astrakhan, was in all probability the son of a French aristocrat who had fled to Russia from the reign of terror. Like so many of his compatriots, one should not attach much significance to the testimony of Dostoevsky's daughter, Lyubov, who, among other stories and fantasies of hers, informs us that Maria's father was supposedly one of Napoleon's Mamelukes, who, taken prisoner in 1812, was sent to Astrakhan, where he had captivated the heart of some merchant's young daughter. She married him and made him an officer in the army. Although Lyubov admits that Maria's appearance did not betray her African extraction, she could not refrain from commenting, like all negresses, she was crafty. This fairy tale about Maria's extraction, like so many other details at her expense, had one definite purpose: to vilify her, to prove that she was given to intrigues and deception, and that Dostoevsky had not loved her. We know that Anna, the author's second wife, painstakingly crossed out of his letters all the passages wherein he spoke of his love for Iseva, or praised her. This jealousy towards his past was evidently transmitted to her daughter as well, and she also tried to blacken Maria. Actually, Colonel Constant's daughter had received an education that was good by the standards of the time. In 1854, she was 28 or 29, a rather handsome blonde of medium height, very thin, of a passionate and highly strung nature, is Wrangel's description of her. She was widely read, sufficiently educated, fond of knowledge, and unusually animated and impressionable. In a contemporary daguerreotype, which has come down to us, her wavy light hair is parted in the middle. The mouth is somewhat wide, with the lowest lip prominent, and just a little puffy, giving a capricious expression to the entire face. That her features were small but attractive, while her cheeks had a hectic flush. Her appearance was, on the whole, frail and sickly, and in this respect she at times must have reminded Fyodor of his mother. The gentleness of her face, her physical weakness, and a certain defenselessness aroused his desire to help her, to guard her as one would a child. That fusion of the infantile and the feminine, which always appealed so strongly to the susceptible Dostoevsky, on this occasion also aroused with him complex emotions he neither could nor would clarify. Maria had instantly cast a spell over him by her maternal solitude or solicitude, while her fragility attracted him physically. Besides that, he was enraptured by her exquisite and unusual nature, or so it seemed to him. Maria was nervous, almost hysterical, but Dostoevsky, especially at the beginning of their relationship, perceived in the inconstancy of her moods, the breaks in her voice, and her ready tears, signs of deep and exalted feelings. When he began calling on the Isaves, Maria took pity on her eccentric guest and was kind to him, although she hardly took his exceptional nature into account. Simply as a woman, she sensed that this clumsy private, who could sit for hours almost without a word and then suddenly, taking fire, deliver long tirades which were not always comprehensible, had endured more than any of the people she knew, and she found it pleasant to be his good angel, to feel his lightning quick and grateful reaction to every kind word, to every concerned glance. It flattered her overdeveloped vanity. Besides that, she herself was in need of support at that time. Her life was tedious and lonely. She could not keep up her friendships because of her husband's drunkenness and outrageous actions, to say nothing of there being no money for entertaining anybody. And although she bore her cross proudly and conscientiously, fulfilled the duties of a servant, and tended her husband and son, she often wanted to complain, to unload the painful burdens of her heart, and Dostoevsky was a superb listener. He was always at hand, had an excellent understanding of her wrongs, helped her to bear all her misfortunes with dignity, and above all, he diverted her from the morass of provincial tedium. I never left their house. What happy evenings I passed in her company. Rarely have I met such a woman, he wrote later on. The husband preferred a grog shop to his home, or else sprawled half drunk on the divan, and Maria found herself alone with Fyodor, who shortly ceased to conceal his adoration of her. Never, during his whole life, had he experienced any such intimacy with a woman, and a woman from society at that, and cultured, with whom he could talk about all the things that occupied his thoughts. For the first time in many years, he was not met with jeers. He did not have to contend with rivals, as in Paneva's salon. He did not feel himself humiliated, but could be on an equal footing with the woman he loved. It is quite possible that Isaeva, I don't know how you say that, Isaeva became attached to Dostoevsky, but she was not at all in love with him, at least not in the beginning, even though she may have rested her head on his shoulder and responded to his kisses. He, however, fell hopelessly in love with her, accepted as reciprocated feeling what was on her part no more than amiability, interest, and a light flirtation out of boredom. He was going on 34, and he had never yet had an inamorata, someone to care for both idealistically and passionately. I mean, he was in prison for, 7 years? He was seeking love, he was in need of love, and the crystallization of his emotions found an excellent object in Maria. She was the first intelligent young woman he had met after 4 years at hard labor, and he wreathed her with all the flowers of his unsatisfied desire, his erotic fantasies and romantic illusions. All the joy of life became incarnate for him in this emaciated blonde woman. She seemed charming, graceful, and clever, kind-hearted, and desirable. And to round it all off, she was unhappy. She was suffering, and suffering not only attracted him as a writer, but overwhelmed his imagination and aroused an immediate, impulsive response to him as a man. Sensitivity to the grief of others heightened in a strange manner his erotic excitability. Sadistic and masochistic inclinations were interwoven in him in a most peculiar fashion. To love meant to sacrifice oneself and to respond with all one's soul, in all one's body to the suffering of another, even at the cost of torments. But on occasion, to love meant to torture in one's own turn, to cause suffering, to wound and hurt the person loved. Then the highest delight lay in eventual sacrifice, in relieving the suffering just inflicted, to jump into the flames after kindling them, to brave everything for her sake. Maria was not easy to get along with. She was quick to take offense. She had frequent attacks of migraine due to her worries and troubles. Pardon, almost burped. She had a way of pressing her fingers to her temples in a gesture of despair. She was subject to constant irritation and was forever saying that the vile society in the little town did not appreciate her. She called herself a martyr, while Dostoevsky agreed and was quick to sympathize with her. She did not love her husband, or she had ceased to love him. At any rate, the remnants of whatever feelings she may have had for him were destroyed by his preposterous behavior and his drinking, which aroused her anger and aversion. She had shifted all her hopes to her son Pasha, who in her opinion was bound to become a remarkable man, although so far the 7-year-old boy evinced no outstanding qualities. Although Maria might keep saying endlessly that her life was over and done with, the fact remained that she was not yet 30, and of course she longed not only for life but love and happiness and good fortune. That Dostoevsky had come to love her ardently, with a genuine deep passion, she understood very well. Women usually have little trouble in recognizing these things, but she accepted his courting, as she called it, without attaching any great significance to it. After all, he had been deprived of civil rights. He was a transported convict, and to use another phrase of hers, had no future. But despite his numerous and at times frightening peculiarities, one could depend on him, and she was in no position to overlook even a feeble prop. After the intoxicating fog of first love had disappeared, Dostoevsky made out rather clearly those special circumstances in which his feeling toward Maria had been born. The mere fact that a woman held out her hand to me marked a veritable epoch in my life, he admitted later on. He began to see still more clearly all the difficulties of his relations with a married woman and a mother when he had the opportunity of discussing them in endless talks with his new friend, Wrangel. Well, we finally got to meet Maria, so that's a boon. Too bad February is encroaching rapidly, and this book is going to be put aside for another. Since it's so-called Black History Month, I'm going to read some choice books. All right, Bobs, that's all. Goodbye.